welcome Ezekiel James Pickering with his thesis, Casualties of No-Kill Animal Shelters. Thank you.
Beaten, malnourished, neglected, and then thrown from a vehicle. Austin calls this mercy. Tossed in a cage, doomed to live out a life sentence alongside savage cellmates. Also mercy. But to put an end to that, to let one plagued by the nightmare of every waking hour drift finally and peacefully into sleep, and to let a heart that's never known a tranquil beat rest, that's cruelty. Here in Austin, under the banner of mercy, animals are dealt a great deal of harm. Should you take a stroll through one of our shelters today, the atmosphere of suffering would be almost palpable. In every thundering bellow from every inconsolable dog, you could discern a certain hopelessness. In each matted and mangy face would sit the forlorn eyes of an undeserving prisoner. This, a twisted sense of justice, haunts the lives of our shelter animals every day because of the ironically named no-kill movement. Now, an animal can be taken to a shelter if it's found on the street and has no one to care for it, or it can be relinquished to a shelter by its owners if they no longer wish to care for it. Animal shelters are to animals what nursing homes are to senior citizens. The animals there are typically lonely, as many nursing home residents are, and while they're sustained adequately, there's a definitive lack of nurture that all living creatures desire. But where the elderly are free to amble about and are provided with plenty of bingo, animals in shelters are confined daily to small, cramped cages, much akin to a jail cell. And where nursing homes are typically havens of tranquility, animal shelters are permeated by the unsettling and perpetual din of barking dogs, the shrill screeches of cats, the fetid aroma of feces, and the pungent odor of urine. Just as none of us cherish the prospect of life in a nursing home, our animals certainly wouldn't wish to end up in a shelter. Animal shelters in general are divided into two categories, standard and no-kill. Standard shelters will euthanize some of their inhabitants for a variety of reasons, but in a no-kill shelter, the only acceptable euthanasia candidates are the terminally ill or irredeemably vicious. No-kill shelters strive to achieve a 90% live outcome rate, meaning that of all the animals that enter the shelter, less than 10% are euthanized. Austin has primarily 3 shelters: Austin Pets Alive, Austin Humane Society, and Austin Animal Center, or AAC. The former 2 shelters are privately owned, and of the 3, Austin Animal Center runs the largest operation. Austin Animal Services, a department of the City of Austin, funds and operates Austin Animal Center. That is to say, tax dollars are responsible for almost all of its expenses. Also, its website states that about 16,000 animals come through its doors each year. In 2010, the City of Austin passed a no-kill proposition and has since become the figurehead of the movement. Going no-kill may sound reasonable, but the consequences of the policy have proved very detrimental. Where standard shelters recognize their limitations, their no-kill counterparts go to drastic and damaging measures to keep so many animals alive. The no-kill proposition passed by the Austin City Council should be repealed. The first reason, no-kill shelters are far too expensive. The second, they cause bad adoptions, those being animals given to unfit owners or unfit animals adopted out. And the third reason is that contrary to popular opinion, no-kill shelters are inhumane. They reduce the quality of life of their inhabitants. The financial detriment caused by the practices of no-kill shelters is significant. A study titled The Economic Impacts of the Austin, Texas No-Kill Resolution found that the average cost per animal taken into an Austin shelter was $715. That's $300 more than an entire family below the poverty line has to live on for a week. The same study also showed that Austin has a higher cost per intake even than Chicago, whose Animal Services Department has twice the annual budget and takes in 3 times as many animals. Before no-kill, Austin Animal Services alone made up 0.2% of Austin's annual budget, but it's since become far more costly. In fact, the 2014 budget for Austin Animal Services was in excess of $8.5 million. The next year, that number increased to $10.7 million and increased again to over $12 million in 2016. This year, the budget is upwards of $14 million. Since the no-kill proposition was passed, the budget for Austin Animal Services has more than doubled and now takes up 75% more of our annual budget than it did pre-no-kill. You don't need a degree in rocket science to see that the budget and your taxes are only going to increase as the years advance. In order to accommodate the increase in the number of animals it had to house after the no-kill proposition was passed, the city of Austin promptly had to open a newer, larger animal shelter. This $12 million construction project gave us Austin Animal Center, the offspring of the dilapidated Town Lake Animal Center. Even with a whole new building, though, Austin Animal Services was immediately running out of space. Last year, AAC was forced to make a $6 million renovation to add just 44 new kennels. Sadly, the high price tag only added about 13% more room than before and came just a year after an almost identical $6.5 million renovation. Because they're always operating beyond maximum capacity, our no-kill shelters are in a constant and desperate need for more room, a seriously expensive predicament. The Graduate School of Social Work out of the University of Denver conducted a study on Austin shelters, presumably because we're a forerunner in the no-kill cause. The study concluded that between the period of 2011 to 2016, the additional money spent just to operate all of Austin's shelters amounted to $41 million. Also, as a direct result of the no-kill proposition, residents of the city of Austin had spent an additional $50 million on veterinary and pet care over the same time frame. In a span of just 5 years, the no-kill philosophy cost us almost $100 million. The city of Austin stated after an official audit that the Animal Services Department, quote, does not have sufficient facilities and resources allocated to meet the 90% life outcomes goal and remain in line with state requirements and industry best practices. These claims were based on a lack of appropriate housing units and inadequate staffing, among other things, and those are problems only solved by upping the budget and pulling more money out of your pockets, or a shift in shelter philosophy. The second reason we should abolish no-kill shelters is because their practices produce a serious risk for a bad adoption. By that, I mean an adoption which is problematic either for the animal itself or for the adopters. These can be aggressive animals who harm their new owners, seriously ill animals who cost huge sums of money to keep alive, animals given to families tight on money who can't afford to adequately care for them, or animals adopted out to cruel people who abuse or neglect them. Our no-kill shelters inadvertently cause these types of bad adoptions because they're so desperate to make room that they can't take proper precautions when adopting animals out. One of the biggest ways our no-kill shelters attempt to make space is by hosting Clear the Shelter or free adoption days. And those are exactly what they sound like. Heavily marketed days where the animals essentially go on clearance. In fact, all you really need to adopt an animal on one of these days is a valid ID and 18 years under your belt. Here in Austin, these events happen monthly, but this type of promotion diminishes the quality of home an animal will be adopted into. Take the story of Valerie, a dog adopted during Clear the Shelter Day found just 2 weeks later on the side of the road, malnourished and abused. Tragically, she died shortly after being taken to an emergency clinic and identified via microchip. The amount of stories just like hers is heartbreaking, and doubtless there are countless undocumented cases. The head of a prominent rescue group in Los Angeles, a no-kill city, says that she routinely sees families impulse buy a pet on a free adoption day and then change their mind just days later. No-kill shelters are proud to display how many animals they've adopted out, but are reluctant to show how many quickly return. The Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science has stated that animals adopted for less than $100 were at a higher risk of being returned. This proves that when our no-kill shelters hold their free adoption days, they put the animals at a higher risk of ending up right back in a cage. The same study also noted that 1 in 10 of these animals was not in the home 6 months after adoption. Furthermore, if a prospective owner can only afford an animal on a free adoption day, then he or she certainly should not own a pet. The average annual cost for owning a cat or dog is upwards of $1,000. And keep in mind, these animals live for about 15 years. I have slept through my fair share of economics classes this year, but a $15,000 impulse buy seems foolish. Another of the ways our no-kill shelters attempt to clear out space is by sending occupants off to rescue organizations. These are small nonprofit groups which take animals from the shelter and find them homes. But these rescues often have their own personal agendas which overshadow the best interests of the adopter and animal. Behavioral specialist Dr. Laurie Bergman says she, quote, sees it all the time. Rescues put their own spin on things. In 2015, a Tennessee man was mauled to death by a Rottweiler he'd adopted the very same day. course, that's an extreme case, but the danger when no-kill shelters adopt out aggressive animals is very real. During a 4-year period under the no-kill banner, the number of annual dog bites in Travis County rose by 136. 2014 was an especially dangerous year for those seeking to adopt, as the dog bite rate out of Austin Animal Center increased by 20%. The numbers show that the practices of no-kill shelters are directly correlated with an increased risk of being injured by an adopted animal. We wouldn't let dangerous criminals go free, much less invite them into our homes and let them play with our children. So why do we do it with animals? Another bad adoption could be one in which the animal turns out to have grievous and costly medical issues. I work in an animal hospital, so I can tell you firsthand that it's not so uncommon to see foster owners put in charge of animals with life-threatening or grievous conditions like cleft palate, open wounds, distemper, infections, etc., which can require intense nursing and care. Even worse, these animals are still owned by the shelter, so the foster caretakers cannot legally receive any medical help or advice from their own veterinarian. Take the story of Harley, an inhabitant of the Toronto Humane Society, adopted out to people who soon discovered she'd long been suffering from a shattered leg and dislocated kneecap in a shelter supposed to care for her. These unfortunate new owners were thus compelled to spend hundreds of dollars on treatments, but situations like these could be avoided if our shelter veterinarians were able to euthanize humanely instead of having to worry about a benchmark percentage. The very nature of the no-kill proposition, more specifically the requirement of AAC to meet a 90% live outcome rate, means that they're heavily incentivized to give away as many animals as they can. In fact, Austin Animal Center sent off so many animals to Austin Pets Alive alone last year that without them, AAC would have only reached an 81% live outcome rate. Worse than that, in 2017, Austin Pets Alive let 642 of these animals die in their kennels. How's that for mercy? The first principle of veterinary medical ethics states that the medical judgment of a veterinarian shall not be influenced by contracts or agreements made by their associations or societies. That statement is in direct contradiction with the no-kill policy. Veterinarians can't euthanize the animals that should be, so our shelters are desperate to make room and end up dumping animals on people who either don't know what they're getting into or who have nefarious intentions. This brings us to the third reason that Austin's no-kill shelters should be reoriented. At first glance, the no-kill movement appears entirely righteous and harmless, but a closer inspection of its policies and their implications reveals its inhumane consequences. You might be surprised to discover that the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, a name you probably recognize as one of the largest and most outspoken proponents of animal rights and animal well-being, is actually one of the most vehement and formidable adversaries of the no-kill cause. PETA compares the efforts of the movement to a man who, seeing kittens floating past him in a stream, jumps in enthusiastically to save each one, oblivious to the real problem, the other person ways upstream throwing kittens in the water. Even PETA believes that going no-kill is a shallow and ineffective solution to a much deeper problem. An article titled Guidelines for Standards of Care in Animal Shelters, written by the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, states that every shelter has a capacity for care, which is determined by factors like the number of appropriate housing units, staffing for programs and services, staff training, and average length of stay. The journal states that operating beyond an organization's capacity for care is an unacceptable practice. Keep in mind, this is coming from the authority on shelter procedures. Now, remember the audit commissioned by the City of Austin that I mentioned earlier? It revealed that Austin Animal Services was in violation of almost every single one of the aforementioned factors contributing to capacity for care. The auditor concluded that the City of Austin displayed a lack of appropriate housing units, inadequate staffing for various programs and services, inappropriate cohabitations of animals, and extended lengths of stay. By the very standards of care outlined by veterinarians, no-kill shelters are unacceptable. In 2012, City Council member Mike Martinez voiced concerns of Austin shelter volunteers who claimed that the staff was overburdened and that the health and safety of animals was being put at risk. Abigail Smith, Chief Animal Services Officer, stated about the shelter's efforts, quote, "We're limping along and doing our best." Do those sound like words of success? As recently as May of 2018, the City of Austin published on its official website an article titled, "Austin Animal Center is Out of Space." Despite good intentions, the no-kill vision has proved overwhelming and unrealistic. We shouldn't jam as many animals into our shelters as we can and reduce their health. Instead, let's aim for quality of life over quantity of life. The Canadian Veterinary Journal states that overcrowding in animal shelters reduces animal welfare. It increases susceptibility to infection, induces adverse stress, and concentrates infectious particles. It's an all too common sight at the shelter to see dogs suffering from mange or sick cats with mucus running out of their noses. The roar of hundreds upon hundreds of barking dogs makes for an unpleasant habitat. The journal states that regular exercise and handling of shelter dogs has been positively correlated with increased adoption rates. The very act of being with the dog, even by walking it, socializes the animal. In most cases, it'll be more well-behaved and friendlier. Neglected and depressed animals are just less appealing. But because our no-kill shelters are so severely understaffed and overcrowded, proper care and attention cannot be afforded to every animal, and that drives adoption rates down. As the overcrowding in our shelters continues to increase, the quality of life of its inhabitants and their chances at adoption decrease. To use an apt, if morbid, analogy, there's a reason that prisoners convicted of crimes grievous enough to warrant the death penalty aren't dealt with quickly. An unintentional yet effective part of the punishment is to wait decades on death row with no hope of relief. We shouldn't let our animals suffer a life behind bars of their own. Sometimes a swift and gentle death is better than a lifetime of anguish. Now, before you call me an animal murderer, I'd like to clarify. These standard shelters, the ones who will euthanize, aren't excited about killing animals. They aren't needle happy. The principles of veterinary medical ethics state that the veterinarian shall first consider the needs of the patient to prevent and relieve disease, suffering, or disability while minimizing pain or fear. I work at an animal hospital, so I know that for most veterinarians, euthanasia is the least favorite part of their job. Most simply recognize the necessity for it. And in the case of aggressive animals, there's really no reason that the health and safety of human beings should be put at risk. Given the choice between the life of a child and the life of a dog, I think most sensible people would choose the child. Our lives are just far more valuable than theirs. Another sad truth is that some animals are just more likely to be adopted than others. A study published in the U.S. National Library of Medicine determined that phenotypic characteristics like size, breed, and even coat color can influence how quickly, if ever, an animal is adopted. Furthermore, length of stay of dogs increases linearly as age does. So where a puppy might be adopted in a matter of days, an older dog may never be. And these elderly animals continue to accumulate health issues, which reduce their quality of life even further and cost more money. If that breaks your heart, then go take one home. But the harsh reality is that there are just far more dogs out there than will ever be adopted. But if we let them pile up in our shelters, we are not doing any good for ourselves or for them. After careful examination, I think you'll agree that the no-kill philosophy isn't as righteous as it first appears. It's produced a great deal of suffering for the inhabitants of Austin, two- and four-legged. And at its core, the movement isn't no-kill, it's no guilt. It's about doing what makes us feel good and not about what's actually best for our animals. But by recognizing the necessity for euthanasia in our shelters, we make our city cleaner, safer, and a more caring place for our pets. We maximize the time and money we have to provide the best homes to the animals who are most suited for them. We eliminate many dangers from aggressive animals and abusive owners, and we bring a peaceful end to so many suffering animals. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. All right, on Zeke's panel, big surprise, same four folks, but if you're new to the room, here they are. So we have Nathan Eloquin. Since writing and presenting his senior thesis on education and standardized testing, Nathan went on to receive 2 bachelor's degrees and a master's of science in instructional design and evaluation. He currently works as the instructional designer for Google's Cloud Technical Residency Program at their office right here in Austin. Susan Sprouse has been a parent at Veritas for 10 years now. Currently, she works as an estate planning and probate attorney with the Sprouse Law Firm. Disclaimer, her questions and comments this evening may or may not reflect her true opinions and beliefs. We have Jimmy Miller, who has a bachelor's in communications from the University of Texas and a master's in church history from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. James is passionate about organizing historical research in new forms and reinserting theology as a core component to historical discussion. He currently works to create and refine corporate learning and onboarding pedagogy. His favorite episode of Classical Stuff You Should Know is Everyone's a Critic. Jordan Vermont he currently serves as the chair of Veritas School Board. Jordan is married to Bianca, and they have 5 children, all enrolled at Veritas Academy. Jordan is a partner and litigator with the law firm of Reed Collins & Sy, LLP. As a practicing attorney, Jordan represents clients nationally and internationally in complex business litigation. So, floor is yours. Susan.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Very well done. Okay, so the first thing that kind of hits me is something I read in a book called Freakonomics.
Okay.
And in this book, the guy drew a parallel between when abortion became legal and the drop in crime rate, okay? And I actually had somebody tell me that was her justification why she supported abortion, right? Because she said, look what happens. We get less crime, right? So I am concerned about this policy that we would be devaluing life in general, to say just because something is old or sick or inconvenient, let's kill it, right? I mean, so it's going to be the dogs and then, next the old people and, where does it stop?
So I certainly don't condone euthanasia for old folks or anything of that nature, but I'd like to kind of continue to answer that question by saying the no-kill movement has been entirely started by non-veterinarians, and it's mostly supported by common folk like me and you, but not me. So veterinarians are the ones who have historically been the people who carry out euthanasia, the people who dictate whether or not euthanasia should happen. I actually have a quote from the American Veterinary Medical Association. It's on euthanasia. They have a big, long article about it. They say, euthanasia may be considered to be the right course to spare an animal from what is to come if medical intervention would only prolong a terminal condition or if current health conditions cannot be successfully mitigated. So veterinarians are the people who historically have been deciding whether or not euthanasia should occur, and they're not the ones, at least they're not the main supporters or they're not the bulk of supporters for the no-kill movement. So I think it's a little, it's not true that this is going to devalue animal lives to a point they've never seen before, because the no-kill movement is very recent. It started in 1984 with a man named Rich Avanzino, and veterinarians have long been euthanizing animals for the right reasons. And this is something that non-veterinarians do too. So if a farmer's horse breaks its leg, they euthanize the horse. They don't let it live with 3 legs because it can't run. We hunt deer to eat them. It's not like we're saying that the killing of animals has never been some massive moral objection that people have had, and it's a very recent idea that we should not kill any of them. And I think the main bulk of people who support that idea don't actually know what all it entails. Does that answer your question?
Great job.
Thank you.
So I completely understand and agree with the fact that you didn't go into sort of the legal ramifications of what would happen if we were to implement this policy, but if I may, I'd like to walk down those steps and get your thoughts on that. So we repealed the no-kill policy. There are 3 animal shelters in Austin currently, 2 of which are privately owned, I think is what you said. What happens exactly? Do they then have to start killing at a minimum quota, or how exactly does that end up getting implemented?
The main objection I have with the no-kill movement is the 90% benchmark. The fact that you have a number associated with what you're working towards means you're then working towards a number and you're not working towards what's best for the animals. So when I say repeal no-kill, what I mean is take away this benchmark percentage that shelters have to reach in order to be humane, because it really ties veterinarians' hands and they can't make the decisions they're trained to make with regards to an animal's well-being.
What percentage would you be comfortable with?
So this is the national average and nationally most shelters are standard, so about 20% are no-kill nationally. But again, the national average for animals that are euthanized in shelters is about 50% of them that come in. There are about, that said, pre-no-kill in Austin, we were hovering around 80% save rate. So it's not to say that if you repeal no-kill, then suddenly all of the animals are going to be killed.
A follow-up, what are, if any, the penalties for a shelter who does not reach 90%?
So as far as I'm concerned, the city of Austin isn't going to fine a shelter if this happens, and that's because it hasn't happened yet. Since the no-kill proposition was passed, we've been at least at 90% the whole time. So there's been no even discussion of having to penalize a shelter for that.
So if I can get this straight, if there are no penalties, right, what would prevent someone like yourself who believes that euthanasia is sometimes the right course from categorizing more dogs than normal as irredeemably aggressive and therefore subject to euthanasia to get around the rules?
So you're saying if someone like me worked in the shelter?
I'm saying someone who took your stance.
Yeah,
that
worked in the
euthanasia-
shelter and was...
Correct.
Okay.
What prevents them, if there's no penalty from being under 90%, what prevents them from simply going around the rule?
So as far as I'm concerned, nothing would prevent one person from marking an animal as too aggressive to be kept alive. But that said, veterinarians are the only ones able to carry out a euthanasia or say that a euthanasia should occur. So first of all, it's not like any Joe that volunteers or works at the shelter is able to just go euthanize an animal whenever they want. Secondly, veterinarians, again, are trained to make those kind of decisions, and if a veterinarian, say, went rogue and started euthanizing animals all over the place, there's something called the Board of Medical Examiners, which oversees them, and they would be able to investigate some kind of situation like that and then revoke a license or administer a fine. They have all the power in those kinds of cases. So it has never been a problem before, and if someone were to go, a veterinarian were to go rogue, they would be stopped swiftly.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Much of your presentation focused on the financial cost
Mhm.
of having the no-kill policy, but when we're talking about life, and many people would value animal life on the same level, maybe slightly lower, but near the same level as human life, isn't really the solution here more resources, larger facilities, more dollars so we can protect life in the city of Austin?
So this is a good question. It's definitely not an issue of more space. Like I said, when the no-kill movement or the no-kill proposition was passed back in 2011 or 2010, about the next year, the city of Austin opened a new shelter because they foresaw that they were going to have too many animals. And within a matter of weeks, it was full again. And the thing is, just having more kennels in a shelter for dogs to go really just means you have more opportunities for those dogs to sit their whole lives in a shelter and never be adopted. Like I said, in 2017, Austin Pets Alive let 600 or almost 700 animals just die in their kennels. And that's not, in my opinion, mercy. If I see you suffering on the side of the road, I don't, if you see, let's say you see a puppy on the side of the road, you don't just leave it and let it die and say, well, I didn't kill it, so that's mercy. So I think it's not a matter of space, and if money was no object and you wanted to keep continuing to expand the shelter, and you didn't care how much money you were putting towards that, you wouldn't be fixing the problem. You would only be increasing the number of animals that could live out their life in the shelter, which is not quality of life enough to be sustained.
Well, that's really interesting. Pardon me. That's interesting to me that they built a bigger facility and immediately it was filled up, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we refocus on maybe spaying and neutering, I mean, how much could they keep doing that, right? Eventually, things are going to dry up, right?
So pet overpopulation would be the root cause of overcrowding in shelters. There are about, let me find the exact number so I don't get this wrong. Sorry. 70 million, sorry, that took me a while. 70 million stray animals in America. 8 million are taken into shelters annually. So there's far, like I said, far more animals out there than will ever be adopted, and far more than ever come into the shelter. So say we start neutering all the cats that we want, and we actually do that. There's something called trap, neuter, release, where we take animals or cats especially are taken into the shelter, neutered, and then released onto the street so that they won't have more babies, and so that the thought is that it'll diminish pet overpopulation. But that's really not, combating pet overpopulation is a losing battle. 70,000 cats are born every day in America, so unless you want to go kill 70,000 cats or trap and neuter 70,000 cats a day, it's really not a realistic goal. Instead, we could start euthanizing some animals in our shelter, and then that number will slowly diminish over time.
I think another part of your presentation talked about the dangerous behavior of many dogs and the effect that has on people. But it also seems like your policy is going to affect not just dogs, but cats and maybe other animals. So why are these other animals having to suffer from the alleged dangerous behavior of dogs when they're not necessarily dangerous?
So your question is, so by no means the aggressiveness of a dog is going to mean you have to euthanize a cat. If there's
Well, let me clarify my question,
Okay.
because you're saying that because dogs are dangerous, therefore some dogs must be euthanized.
Yep.
Therefore, we must get rid of the no-kill policy. But that same argument doesn't apply to cats unless there are dangerous cats out there, besides one that bit my wife several years ago. But aside from that one, I don't know, is there a problem with dangerous cats?
So cats are, less dangerous than dogs, obviously. They're a lot smaller. They don't pack as much of a punch. But that's, again, not the only reason that we need to repeal no-kill. It's not just because there are aggressive animals. So, and I'm sure that there have been aggressive cats that have been euthanized in the past. I can tell you from working at an animal hospital that there are quite a few aggressive cats have been, they've drawn blood from me several times. But did I answer your question? I feel like I did. Okay.
You did.
So,
I was pointing at Jimmy.
Ladies first. It's okay. Early on in your presentation, you said that there are some drastic measures that Austin shelters take to keep animals alive to their detriment. Could you expand on what you mean by drastic measures?
Okay, so that would be like letting aggressive animals stay in the shelter and then be adopted out and hurt someone. That would be like a terminally ill animal that they can't kill, so and this is something that Austin does, about 1,000 of the most sick or unhealthy or aggressive animals, Austin Animal Center sends off every year. So they get a certain number of animals and they know that this one would probably need to be euthanized. So they just send it somewhere else. They get their number, they get their stat that animal had a live outcome. So that's great. And then, like I said, plenty of those animals go on to die in a shelter or hurt someone or are sent into the foster care system, and some poor, kind soul has to pay a ton of money to keep that animal alive. So those are the kind of things that they do. I'd like to touch on one quick story that I didn't get to weave into the speech because I didn't have enough time, but I think it illustrates the kind of ridiculousness that can occur in these no-kill shelters. So back in 2016, the city of Austin, or Austin Animal Services specifically, was made aware of a cockfighting rooster ring out in Weberville, Texas. And being the heroes they perceived themselves to be, they took these roosters, about 20 of them, took them into the shelter, and then started a campaign to get them adopted out. Now, I don't know if anyone is familiar with roosters in general. They're mean. They're not pets. Cockfighting roosters are even worse. You would never want that animal as a pet. So Austin Animal Center took it upon themselves to find homes for these 20 horrible animals. It's just that kind of ridiculousness, these drastic measures they go to are detrimental and sometimes ridiculous like that.
Susan, sorry.
it's
Not
okay.
last time.
So you were saying before, some people get stuck with an animal that has extensive medical needs.
Mhm.
Couldn't they just take the animal back?
So in the foster, they have a foster system that's, I don't know, analogous to foster systems with people. So you would take an animal in and you have a responsibility to care for it. And oftentimes you are either too ignorant or apathetic enough to not check to make sure that animal doesn't have any conditions, or sometimes they just don't tell you. I think 2 weeks ago in the animal hospital I work at, some poor foster owner was put in charge of an animal that had distemper in the past. They weren't made aware of it. So then that animal had to have basically all of its teeth pulled. That's thousands of dollars. So the shelter just dumped that on someone, and that person they weren't even told about it, so there's nothing they could have known. And then I suppose they could give it back if they really wanted to, but that's not really how the system works. It's not like you take an animal and then decide you don't want it a day later and give it back.
Okay.
Okay.
So I am interested in some costs that might arise as the result of
Okay.
repealing the no-kill,
Mhm.
in that shelters presumably would be euthanizing more of their pets.
Mhm.
I know that at least with regards to death row, the way that we do euthanasia is incredibly expensive. I don't know what the cost structure is, but so in addition to the euthanasia itself with respect to the pets, are there any other costs that might arise as the result of repealing this this particular statute? And do you have any figures to back up those numbers?
So, off the top of my head, I can't imagine that there would be any pressing costs more than euthanizing the animal. I mean, we're talking about we don't have to expand our shelter anymore, and again, that costs $6 million every time they do it. So we wouldn't have to do that anymore. There would be you wouldn't have to feed animals for nearly as long, and you would have less animals in the shelter. So honestly, in the 30 seconds that I've thought about this question, I can't think of any other costs that would arise. I'm not sure if you had one in mind that you
Do you happen to know how much it might cost for the euthanasia or the euthanizing itself?
So I'm not exactly sure the exact price. The drug that's used, pentobarbital, it fluctuates in price a little bit, and so all that you'd really need to be paying for would be the cost of that drug every time you need to buy a new bottle, and paying your veterinarian to do that. And it's a quick procedure, to be frank. So it's not exponentially expensive, and again, it costs $715 to keep an animal in a shelter on average. So I can't imagine it would be anywhere close to that amount of money.
Is another potential solution not killing these animals, but perhaps letting nature take its course and relocating them? You know, for example, if it's not something that maybe the collective will of Austin is willing to repeal, couldn't we just transfer these animals to a place that doesn't have a no-kill policy, or perhaps some of them just release them out into nature? We had 2 cats here at Veritas. One is gone. Nature
This
does
is
take
news
its
to
course.
me. No, I'm just kidding.
So why don't we just send them somewhere else? Is that your
Yes.
question? So you can't be releasing dogs into the wild. That's a terrible idea because they form into packs and then they attack people. It's literally a mob mentality. Packs of wild dogs are very dangerous. You don't just want to let those go. We do release cats, like I said, spay and neutering, but that doesn't nearly solve the problem at all. There's actually more cats in the shelter than there are dogs. There are more cats in general than there are dogs. Remember, 70,000 are born every day. So just releasing them into the wild is not it's not a good idea, and it's not really a solution to the problem.
Okay. Oh, that was awesome. Okay, so in my neighborhood, there's emails that go around about people losing their pets. I just cannot believe how many lost pets there are, frankly. And I mean, I think these people, there's some that are just desperate. They're desperate to get, like they're a baby, right? It's their baby. So what are you going to do with all the people who lose their pets? They call all the shelters, the animals wandering around, it finally gets picked up, and you just killed somebody's baby, right? I mean, what are you going to do about all those, those they're wanted, they're desired, right?
So the easy solution, if you love your pet that much, microchip it. If it goes to the shelter, they scan it for microchips, and if you've registered it to you, they can call you. You can come pick it up. So if you don't care about your pet enough to microchip it or give it a collar, then maybe you should rethink having a pet.
Would you advocate, good point, would you advocate making it illegal to own a pet without chipping it?
I don't think we need to go that far. But I'm going to tell you, if you're going to cry about it, if you lose your pet because you didn't microchip it, that's on you, kind of.
Right. Fair enough.
So one thing that you spoke about, or at least alluded to, was that the predominant supporters of the no-kill policy are people who feel good or want to feel good from doing something that feels morally right to them. And that mostly, if I remember you correctly, veterinarians oppose a no-kill policy, and that those who support it generally aren't educated well enough to know that it's actually inhumane. If you had a megaphone to speak in front of the loudest proponents of the no-kill policy here in Austin, what are some specific figures or pieces of research that you would show them to hopefully change their mind?
I think telling them how many animals sit and die in their cages every year would be good. Honestly, maybe I'd just give them my speech. I memorized it.
Maybe you would.
Yeah. Tell them how expensive it is. Honestly, I'm not sure how much people would listen to that, but in the big picture, I think if people knew all the costs that are associated with it, they would think long and hard about whether or not that's the right course of events. And repealing no-kill doesn't make you a murderer. We're not saying that repealing no-kill doesn't mean we have to kill animals. It simply means we shouldn't have to not kill them.
40 seconds. Quick.
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay.
So what is the percent? You said before one of the bad things is that a lot of they're bad adoptions, right? The animal is vicious or the people can't take care of. So, but do you know the percentage of that versus the good fits versus the bad fits?
So there's not really a way to know exactly how many adoptions are bad, because who's going to report that they had a bad adoption? Also, a lot of these happen because rescues take the animals, and there are dozens of rescues. So you imagine a web of 12 different organizations taking dogs and sending them off to other people. There's really not a way to get good data on with all those variables moving around.
All right. Thank you, Zeke.